So let me welcome everyone to today's panel, Constitutional Remedies to Overturn Citizens United, a Movement Moment. I want to thank our distinguished panel, whom I will introduce shortly, and also thank everyone here. I know this is a very busy time, particularly with the State of the Union tonight, so I think it's a sign of how important this issue is that all of you have turned out. So welcome and thank you for being here. My name is Marge Baker. I'm Executive Vice President of People for the American Way. And in a moment, as I said, I'll introduce our panelists and begin what I expect will be a pretty exciting, rousing discussion. I want to be sure also to talk about issues that are important to you. So as the panel proceeds, I think each of you has an index card. If you have questions that you have a burning desire to have asked, please pass them down to one of two gentlemen, Justin and Calvin, in the back. Just wave the card and they'll pick it up, pass it to this end of the aisle, and I will try to ask as many of those questions as I can. On January 21st, 2010, a narrow 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court issued a decision in Citizens United versus FEC that was a radical and dangerous decision that has opened up the floodgates of corporate and special interest money that threaten to undermine the integrity of our elections and our democracy. We saw the impact in 2010, $450 million of third-party money spent, $126 million of that was from undisclosed sources. We've already seen the impact in the primaries that are going on now. In Iowa, the PAC supporting Mitt Romney outspent the Romney campaign by almost 2-to-1. In South Carolina, super PACs spent 1.5 times what the campaigns did in South Carolina. So we know the impact is there, and what we're seeing now is really the tip of the iceberg as this election cycle kicks off. Last week, over 300 demonstrations and rallies took place around the country at federal courthouses, state capitals, corporate headquarters and communities across the nation, all protesting the Citizens United decision on the occasion of its 2nd anniversary and calling for constitutional remedies. These events were organized by members of a huge constellation of organizations, now more than 60 strong, representing literally tens of millions of members around the country. We're using the banner, United for the People, and this movement is really taking off. Over the last several months, resolutions calling for constitutional amendments have been passed in a host of cities: Albany, New York, Missoula, Montana, Los Angeles, California, Boulder, Colorado, New York City, Portland, Oregon, just to name a few. 12 constitutional amendments, resolutions have been introduced in the 112th Congress, and I understand there may be more to come. We've gone from 27% of the American public knowing about the Citizens United decision after it was decided in 2010 to now 54% of the American public knowing about the decision. In the past 3 days, our allies at Public Citizen, who have been tracking media on this issue, collected more than 250 stories just over the 3 days, January 20th to 23rd. So this has caught the public attention. This is a movement moment that we're in. From the halls of city councils and state legislatures to the halls of the U.S. Congress, constituents are mobilizing in support of amending the Constitution to ensure that we the people means all the people, and not just the powerful and the privileged. There's mobilizing and organizing on all fronts. This isn't just happening in DC, and it's not just happening at the grassroots. average Americans are engaged, and they're finding receptive audiences among their neighbors, in their communities, among their local and state elected officials, and among their federal officials. And it's because the threats to our democracy are so real and the need to respond so compelling. So that's what we want to explore today. What is this movement moment about? How did we get here? Why is it happening? And where do we go from here? And we'll be hearing today from some of the real heroes who have put themselves on the front line of organizing and acting around this really, really vital issue. So with that, let me introduce the panel. I'm going to try to do a brief introduction of everybody on the panel and then ask some questions. And again, reminder that as the panel proceeds, if you've got questions, fill them out on your index card, pass them to Calvin and Justin, just wave them in the air, and I'll try to work your questions in. So on the panel we have Senator Tom Udall. Tom Udall became New Mexico's 17th United States Senator on January 6th, 2009, after 2 decades of public service as a U.S. Representative and New Mexico State Attorney General. He attended Prescott College as well as Cambridge University and the University of New Mexico Law School, served as a law clerk to Chief Justice Oliver Seth of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and later became the New Mexico Attorney General. And as with each of our panelists, I could go on and on and on, but I won't in the interest of time. Elena Nuñez is the Executive Director of Colorado Common Cause. Colorado Common Cause has worked for open and accountable government for more than 40 years. In 2002, she was the campaign manager for Amendment 27, Common Cause's successful statewide campaign finance reform initiative. Elena joined Common Cause in 2006 and managed the effort to pass the voter-approved ethics law, which limits the influence of lobbyist money in state politics. Last fall, Elena served on the leadership team to pass the Boulder corporate personhood referendum. And welcome, Elena. Representative Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison has represented the 5th Congressional District of Minnesota in the U.S. House of Representatives since taking office on January 4th, 2007. He was elected as co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus for the 112th Congress. Working together with other members of the caucus, Representative Ellison helped shape historic healthcare reform, Wall Street reform, raise the minimum wage, start the process to end the war in Iraq, strengthen veterans' benefits, combat hate crimes, and create guarantees of pay equality for women. And I should mention that Representative Ellison has introduced a constitutional amendment resolution, HJ Res 92, as did Senator Tom Udall, who introduced SJ Res 29. New York City Councilwoman Melissa Mark-Viverito is the first Puerto Rican woman and Latina elected to serve as council member for the 8th Council District in New York City. In her current capacity, Councilmember Mark-Viverito is a strong advocate for the creation and preservation of income-targeted housing and is a staunch advocate for the city's public housing programs. She currently serves as chair of the Parks and Recreation Committee, as well as the co-chair of the New York Council Progressive Caucus and co-vice chair of the Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus. Welcome. Representative Ted Deutch is a Democrat who has served Florida's 19th district in Congress since April of 2010. Representative Deutch came to Washington with a record of standing up to special interests. As a Florida state senator, he took on the powerful tobacco lobby in Tallahassee and passed a dollar tax on cigarettes that has generated over $1 billion for health care and cancer research in Florida. In Washington, he has continued to put the people first by fighting for dignity for America's seniors and the most vulnerable, standing up for strong consumer protections, and working to create jobs and economic opportunity for students and young families. And Representative Deutch is the author of HJ Res 90, one of the 12 constitutional amendment resolutions. And I should mention that Councilwoman Mark-Viverito was instrumental in the passage of the New York City resolution calling for constitutional amendment. And then last and certainly not least is Maryland State Senator Jamie Raskin, is a Democratic state senator in Maryland, and full disclosure, a senior fellow at People for the American Way. He's also a professor of constitutional law at American University's Washington College of Law where he directs its program on law and government and its Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Project. He has written dozens of essays and law review articles and several books that are too numerous to mention. In 1999, he founded the Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Project, which has sent many hundreds of law students at 17 different law schools into public high schools to teach thousands of students a semester-long course in constitutional literacy. And Senator Raskin is active in the Maryland State Senate in hopefully introducing a resolution to call for a constitutional amendment. So with that, welcome panel. I really, really, really appreciate your being here. Let me start with a basic question, and I'm going to ask Senator Udall to answer first. But what was the motivating force behind your getting involved in this issue? Why was this a problem that you felt needed to be taken on?
Marge, thank you. And first of all, let me thank United for People and People for putting this together. I think this is something that is needed at this time, and I truly think this is a movement moment. I started observing political life as a kid when my father came to Washington in the 1950s. And as I saw what happened then in terms of elections and what happens today, it's remarkable the change that's taken place. My father was elected to Congress in 1954. He spent about $5,000 in his election, which compared today, the average House seat is Keith and Ted know is $1.5 million or $2 million. He held one fundraiser a year in order to get his campaign coffers up and run his election. And fundraising wasn't a big part of the whole effort to be in public office and to serve the public. As I watched over the years, special interests, lobbyists, and money became more and more important. And so when I was elected State Attorney General, Marge, I saw this as a big problem. I was already aware of the Buckley versus Vallejo ruling, which I think more than anything meant that we were opening up. If you equate money and speech, then the guy with the biggest checkbook is the one that has the most influence. And so a group of us, 25 attorneys general back there in the 1990s, wrote to the Supreme Court. 19 were Democrats, 5 Republicans, urging them to overturn Buckley because we thought that they were headed down the wrong road. I worked for reform in the House, where I spent time in the House. We passed McCain-Feingold only to see the court dismantle that as we went along. And now, as Marge has mentioned, I've introduced a constitutional amendment in the U.S. Senate, and some of our other panel members have done the same. But my conclusion is that our only avenue now, because the courts have taken this over, is to have a constitutional amendment that takes it back from the Supreme Court, basically says Congress shall be able to legislate and regulate and set the rules in terms of campaign finance. The same thing true in our amendment at the state level, state legislatures able to do that. So I think this is something that's long overdue, and money, special interests, and lobbyists have too much influence, and we've got to get control of it.
Thank you. Elena, how about for you? What motivated you to get involved?
Thanks, Marge. So Colorado Common Cause has had a long history working on money and politics issues. It was the first issue that we worked on when we were founded. And over the years, we really saw that a lot of the key reforms that Coloradans had voted for overwhelmingly on the ballot were being undercut piece by piece by piece by a series of Supreme Court rulings. So when Citizens United came to be, we were watching very carefully to see what that would mean for the strong laws in our state and what that meant down the road. And I was quite surprised, actually, because after the Citizens United ruling, there was really an outcry from our members and from the public to talk about the issue and talk about what we could do to fix it. And we talked about legislative reforms like disclosure, and there was support for that, and there was support for other things we could do more immediately. But there was also an outcry that there needed to be something more profound. And that's really what got our board thinking about the need to move down the constitutional amendment path, and that this was going to be a long-term fight to actually take back and reclaim our democracy, to overturn that whole notion of money as speech, as Senator Udall mentioned, that was codified through Buckley, to overturn that whole idea that corporations had constitutional rights the same as real people, that Citizens United then further advanced in the political spectrum. So that really was kind of the motivating factor for Colorado Common Cause. And as that was going on, there were also a lot of activists working in Boulder, organized by Boulder Move to Amend, who came together for the first anniversary of Citizens United. And it was a cold day in Boulder, and there were hundreds of people outside the city council building because they wanted to see reform. And that, coupled by the vote then in Madison, led those activists to realize that there was something we could do on the ground to have a voice, make a difference, and start to move towards that constitutional amendment. So that was the point where Boulder Moved to Amend, working with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center and the Boulder Democratic Party, put together a coalition that Colorado Common Cause joined, and that was really what moved us down the path towards working on the constitutional amendment.
Thank you. Representative Ellison, you've introduced an amendment that's not a resolution, constitutional amendment resolution, which is not something one does every day. What was it that grabbed you? What was it that made you feel this is really what we needed to do?
Well, I introduced my constitutional amendment because I believe that America should be a democracy, not a plutocracy, and that the voice of the individual citizen should prevail, not that of the profit-seeking entity. I don't have anything against corporations. I used to actually have one. I had my law firm, and me and my legal secretary and my investigator, we were a corporation. But our job was to make money practicing law. That's all we were there to do. Hopefully do a little justice, but the main thing was to make food on the table. And that profit-seeking motive that is the sole purpose and basis of an American corporation has its place in our economy, but it should not have a place where it can literally dominate the public square. And that's where we are right now. I used to say we were lurching toward plutocracy. I think we're almost there. And if you look at the numbers on income inequality, which have absolutely skyrocketed, like 275% increase in the share of the economy of the top 1%. I mean, rich people done really, really well. They don't just buy houses and boats and cars with that money. They buy lobbyists and candidates and think tanks and all that kind of stuff, all to get themselves an even better deal than they already have. 2/3 of all American corporations don't pay any taxes at all. Mitt Romney paid 13.9% of his income in taxes. I paid a lot more higher percentage than that. I bet everybody on this table did too. And it's, how did it get that way? Well, it's because they got they got the folks to get them to be able to say they're job creators and then therefore extract concessions out of working people. So we got to put the genie back in the bottle. That means corporations are not people, money is not speech, and democracy should never, ever be for sale.
Thank you. So let's think about the experience you had, Councilwoman, in New York City, and what was it that grabbed you? What was it that motivated you? Why was this such a huge problem that you felt you needed to get engaged?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Marge, and People for the American Way for inviting me. So on behalf of myself and the New York City Council Progressive Caucus, thank you for including us in this panel conversation. I think New York City Council's involvement in this matter is testimony to the fact, to the effectiveness of this movement moment, right? We heard about what LA had done. We heard about what some other municipalities had done. And we decided that obviously there was no way that we could stand back and we needed to weigh in. And so I think that speaks to the fact that this mobilization and this rallying and galvanizing that is happening is leading to change. So in the New York City Council, of which we are 51 members, We represent 8.3 million people in the city of New York. I know it is a city that is really looked upon by many others as an example. We have had incredibly strong campaign finance laws for the past 2 decades, and we continue to make them stronger. Whether or not you participate in our campaign finance program, you cannot accept any money from corporations or lobbyists, corporations and LLCs, and that's really significant. And we continue to look at ways of expanding disclosure. Clearly, the Supreme Court decision will impact also what could happen on the ground in terms of independent expenditures, et cetera. But personally, this was definitely a moment where we could not be silent. When you look at the community and the district that I represent, which is a low-income community, which is a historically disenfranchised community, when you're talking about a community of color, these are the people, we are the people that are left out of the conversation, and money can drown out, an attempt to drown out our voices. And I think that mobilizing and being in the streets and having the numbers to really put pressure on the system is a way that we're going to lead to this constitutional amendment, which I think there's no other way around it. I think what was just said earlier is clear, that we have to take it out of the court's hands and give it back to the people, and this is the moment to do that. So I really want to thank everyone that is lending their voice and their effort to this cause, and I know that New York City Council sent a very strong message. We were overwhelmingly in support of that resolution, and we will continue to encourage other municipalities and other states, hopefully, to really send the similar message.
Thank you. So Representative Deutch, I know that you campaigned on introducing and getting passed a constitutional amendment. When you were elected, you introduced a constitutional amendment. What was it that grabbed you so really early on about the need to do something here?
Sure, and Marge, I join with everyone on the panel in thanking you and People Forward. It's a privilege to be here up on this panel with so many people who have taken leadership positions in what really is a movement. And it's not just about this election. It started, I think, in the last congressional election. The amount of money that was poured into campaigns by these super PACs with unlimited corporate spending as a result of Citizens United created a bitter and horribly nasty campaign throughout America, which I think carried over right into this Congress. And if you look ahead to this coming election in November, you realize that the money that was spent in the congressional is peanuts compared to what's going to be spent in this presidential campaign. I come from Florida. I was thrilled to come back to Washington this week just to get away from the ads that are bombarding all of us every day. Just this morning I read that Newt Gingrich's, one of Newt Gingrich's benefactors is going to put another $5 million into a super PAC. It's clear that it impacts elections. And then if you look at what caused us to redraft our amendment from what we had originally filed, if you look at the Occupy movement and the issues that they were championing, and whether it's income inequality or massive student loan debt or financial irregularities and all of the serious issues that we ought to be addressing, the fact that 50% of America is either in poverty or is a paycheck or two away from falling into poverty. You think about what we ought to be debating here, then you look at what we are debating, and our inability to even come up with, reach a simple consensus that when so many people are struggling, perhaps we can't afford to give subsidies to oil companies. You realize that the decisions that are being made here are being driven so much by special interests and by corporate interests, and not, as Keith says, not being made on behalf of the people. That's why we need to do this. So I introduced the amendment because we have to clarify that corporations aren't people. We have to be clear that they're subject to the regulations of the people through Congress. We have to be very clear that Congress has the authority to regulate both contributions to campaigns and expenditures. And most importantly at this moment, we have to amend the Constitution to clarify that for-profit corporations cannot spend their money, every dollar of which they raised for commercial purposes, to influence the outcome of elections. That's why this is, as you rightly point out, this is a movement moment, and I'm so thrilled that we're having this panel here today.
Thank you so much. And then Senator Raskin, I think the first time I heard you on this issue was in a video that you did that was on the website of ally organization Free Speech for People, talking about Citizens United and how dangerous that decision was. And now I know as a state senator that you are looking into how, as a state senator, you can work on a statewide resolution. So again, the question to you, what was it that motivated you, that got you engaged to understand that we needed to have a constitutional amendment?
Well, thanks, Marge. And yes, I immediately got in touch with Congresswoman Donna Edwards, whose district overlaps mine in Maryland, and we began to work on an effort immediately. I saw this decision as threatening three radical changes: one, in the nature of our democracy; two, in the nature of our constitutional law; and three, in the nature of our economic system. To begin with elections, you know, I think it was our last great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who spoke of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the idea is that democracy should reflect the interests and the needs and the desires of the people, and we all participate. And we bring with us what our self-interests are, but also the founders believed in something called enlightened self-interest, which is that we try to pay attention to the common good and the public interest. And in his brilliant dissenting opinion in the Citizens United case, Justice Stevens says, corporations have no conscience, they have no feelings, they have no sentiment, they have no thoughts, they have no desires. In fact, they have only one purpose by law, which is to make profit. To the extent that a corporation deviates from that purpose, they can be sued by the shareholders. So what we've done is we've introduced literally trillions of dollars of wealth into the political process that has only one purpose, which is to reproduce and expand the wealth of the corporations that are spending it. And that threatens a really radical change in our notion of what democracy is. That's much closer to democracy of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. But the second change is to our jurisprudence. I mean, in order to see how radical a decision this is, you've got to understand that it was the most conservative justices throughout American history who took the position that a corporation is not a person, that it's an artificial creation of the state legislatures. That goes back to Chief Justice John Marshall in the Dartmouth College case in 1819, who said, corporation is an invisible, intangible entity chartered by the state legislature for business purposes and bearing only the rights conferred upon it by the state legislature. And now suddenly, you know, Justice White said in a case called First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, the state need not permit its own creation to consume it. And now in this 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court has essentially said the state must permit its own creation to consume it. We've got the Frankenstein monster has broken free from its creator. So the doctrine that a corporation has no political rights is one that has the imprimatur of Chief Justice Rehnquist, of Justice White, who said, look, corporations are endowed with limited liability of the shareholders, perpetual life, favorable treatment of the accumulation of assets, and so on. All of these direct economic subsidies and benefits conferred by the state, and how can we endow them also with the political rights of the people? And finally, if you think about it, I think the vast majority of American people accept the free market idea that people can form businesses and go out and compete. And if you innovate and you create and you develop better products and you make money on that, that's terrific. You reinvest the money in the business. But this decision promotes what even the Republicans in the primaries are now calling vulture capitalism or crony capitalism, because it gives power to the corporations that have the most wealth to use that wealth investing in campaigns to have power over politicians and over the legislative process. That is not economically productive. That's not going to be conducive to economic growth. That's going to be conducive to a kind of economic cannibalism. So I think that this is the most radical Supreme Court decision of our lifetimes, and we've amended the Constitution 17 times since the Bill of Rights. The vast majority of those amendments have been about the political rights of the people, like women's suffrage and The 15th Amendment giving people the right to vote regardless of race and abolishing poll taxes in the 24th Amendment. And this amendment is very much in the mainstream of our constitutional history. It's the people declaring that we are the sovereigns of the country, and we're not going to let the collusion of a handful of Supreme Court justices and corporations take our democracy away from us.
Thank you. This is an incredible panel. I wish we had more time to hear from all of you, but let's proceed. And again, if you have questions, please make sure you pass them up so that we can try to integrate your questions into this panel. So we've touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious. This is a time we've got a lot of problems. You know, we've got problems with unemployment, problems with jobs, problems with housing, problems with sort of the basic issues as a consumer. You're going to be able to afford the health care you need. Lots of problems out there and lots of issues. And yet we find people mobilizing around a constitutional amendment. So I'd be curious, as you think about the colleagues that you're talking to, whether it's a local organizer talking to other organizers, other citizens, or a senator talking to your colleagues, or a representative talking to your colleagues, or a city council person talking to your colleagues. What is it that you're finding about the ability to bring others to the cause that you think is so important? What's kind of worked? What barriers have you found? Sort of, how have you done it? And Elena, can you start?
Thanks, Marge. You know, one of the great things about the Boulder campaign was that we were out talking to voters every day about the issue and why the constitutional amendment was necessary. And it was interesting because we'd start out with a kind of a standard presentation about the problem of money in politics and the problem of corporate rights. And very quickly, the conversation would shift to whatever the group was working on, and they would have a dozen examples off the top of their head about how either money had blocked a reform they wanted to pass, whether it was an environmental group, the Peace and Justice group. They had some example of either corporate rights gone awry and really trumping the rights of the individual citizens and having their voice in the democracy. So really, for us, it was an incredibly easy organizing opportunity, because once you made the connection that there was something we could do and that the constitutional amendment was a way to kind of regain the people's voice and to reset the dialogue so that people had a greater voice than corporations and the most powerful interests in our society, people really gravitated to it and gave us more examples for the work we were doing. The other thing about Boulder is at the same time that we were working on our ballot measure, there was another ballot measure completely unrelated that had to do with the city's municipalization. The city wanted to take over its electricity because they didn't feel they were getting enough renewable energy from their utility provider. And in order to defeat that, the corporation that was currently providing the power spent millions of dollars in opposition. So it was really a very local example for the citizens of Boulder of the impact that a corporation could have on their community. And Boulder is a place where they have a public financing system, and they really take pride in the fact that you can run for office on relatively limited funds and have your voice heard. So to see a corporation spend $1 million on a local ballot question really drove home, I think, the need for reform. So that, coupled with the environment from the previous election in 2010, where we had a competitive race for U.S. Senate, really showed voters why it was such an important time to get involved. And from there, the need for the constitutional amendment was clear.
Sorry. Senator Udall, you have, I believe, now 20 co-sponsors.
That's correct, 20 co-sponsors.
So you've been talking to your colleagues.
Right.
What is it that's worked in that context?
Well, I think, as Elena has said, and I'm sure we're going to hear from some of our other panelists, the people are speaking on this issue. And it doesn't take long for people to understand when Citizens United is explained to them that the corporate treasuries of the country are open now and able to be spent in our electoral process. And so what does that mean? The next step is saying, well, Exxon has $80 billion in its corporate treasury. If you explain, and so they can expend that wherever they want. They can put it into super PACs, they can put it into a variety of different kinds of independent expenditure formats. When people understand that 100 years ago the Congress acted and banned corporate contributions. And this is what the Supreme Court set aside. They realized that this has changed the playing field dramatically. And so many of the senators, so we have 23 Democrats running this year and another 9 Republicans and an independent, I think, and they all are feeling it, Marge, from the people. They're hearing from people. This has changed the landscape. And just one more comment. I talked a little bit about my dad in those early campaigns. I mean, though the contrast is now so significant between having one fundraiser and raising a small amount and then have a campaign being about working with people, getting your supporters out, having them contact others, to now have these large special interests, lobbyists, corporate contributions making, really changing the whole situation. So I think it's a matter we're seeing the people react to what they know the new reality is, which is Citizens United and where that's going to go.
Thank you. Councilwoman, you in really short order got a resolution passed in New York City. So again, what was resonating with your colleagues? And with your constituents?
Well, I think, you know, as I mentioned, because of the fact that we've had these strong campaign finance laws, that kind of laid the groundwork with regards to it really being easy, right, to convince our colleagues, and we were able to really move this resolution very quickly through the council. So convincing our colleagues at the city level was not extremely complicated. We obviously would love to see New York State do a similar thing. And I think what is going to be effective, the effectiveness of this movement is going to be around how do we bring that down to the local level, right? We have to see this beyond a partisan issue. This is something that really should concern everyone, regardless of what party you're affiliated with. This is about eroding and the corrosive nature of money in politics, and that really does cross those partisan lines. We also have to make the connections of really how does this impact and how does this impact, or why should the constituents that I represent who are facing daily challenges of finding a job, of keeping a roof over their head because their landlord is trying to kick them out of their rent-stabilized apartment, et cetera. How do we make this relevant to the average person that is really trying to make ends meet? And that's important. And making the connections, the voter suppression efforts happening nationwide has to do with this. Mm-hmm. When we talk about the recall efforts in Wisconsin, has to do with this, about how the moneyed interests want to continue to take control of government as a way of enacting policies that will continue to benefit their interests. We've got to make the connections, connect the dots, and see how all of that is really a message that is being sent that something has to be done, that the scales are so unbalanced that we need to really take this matter into our hands as a people and push our representatives to do the right thing. This is a long haul. We're not going to kid ourselves in terms of a constitutional amendment. This has to come back to our states, and we have to convince our legislators that that is the right decision that they have to make, that is the right vote. So there is a lot of groundwork that has to be done, and so that has to be built starting now. But connecting all these dots and seeing how this is a defining moment in our history and a defining moment for our communities, and that it is the voice of the people that has to weigh in here and has to make the ultimate decision. So I really am excited about the potential. It is a lot of work, but that doesn't scare me or my colleagues. We know what has to happen, but we want to join, and we want this mobilization at a nationwide level to continue to really continue to grow. And the last thing I'll say is I'll give a lot of credit is to Occupy Wall Street, clearly, which New York City is the epicenter of that movement, but it really captures a lot of that sentiment about that level of inequality between the 1% and the 99%, and that has to continue. That drumbeat has to continue, and it continues throughout this nation. So that's how I think we have to approach this.
Representative Ellison, I understand that the issues the Councilwoman brought up, the twin issues of voter suppression and Citizens United and the damage it's done, have come up recently, even in the summit that you were recently at. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, they're twin issues. Expanding the corporate presence, diminishing the individual citizen's presence, done simultaneously. It's kind of a Valachi crunch for democracy. What we're talking about here is the 34 states that have introduced legislation that would require some form of a government-issued photographic identification card, oftentimes very narrowly prescribed. An example of what I'm talking about is in Texas. If you show up with your voter ID and you're a student, that ID may not be good enough for you to vote. But if you show up with your gun ID, your concealed carry ID, then the law explicitly says you can use that. And so, these things are happening. 34 states. And by the way, it's not like there's some organic movement to do all this, right? I mean, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has drafted model legislation, recruited legislators all over the country, and said, push this thing. And I tell you, just think about the cases. Rather than, talk about all the law and the history and the stats and all that, tell them about Dorothy Cooper, 98-year-old woman, couldn't vote at all until the segregation laws were torn down in Tennessee. Then after that, she votes in every single election. She shows up recently to vote. She has an ID issued by the Chattanooga Police Department, and they say that ain't good enough and tell her she cannot vote. Or what about the nuns in Indiana? What is it, 11 or 9 of them? I think it was like 11 nuns show up. One of them is 94 years old. They say the voting judge knows her and says, well, how you doing, Sister Mary Margaret? I guess you're here to vote. Isn't that right, dear? Well, yes, dear. I vote every year. Well, where's your government-issued ID, Sister Mary Margaret? Well, I don't have that, dear. I'm a nun. I'm 90. I'm in the convent, and I'm praying and stuff. And I don't drive, and I don't need one. So, well, you can't vote. She's turned away from the polls. And there's case after case after case. From an organizing standpoint, I urge us to talk about the cases, Make people make a heart connection of what these voter IDs bills are doing to people. Make people make a heart connection, not just a cerebral, intellectual connection. Tell them about the stories, and then also approach this as as a campaign. I'm so thrilled that we have municipal leaders, we have state leaders, we have congressional leaders, both houses, all on the same page. We need teach-ins, we need Twitters, we need webinars, we need to get the word out. I guarantee you we can pass this constitutional amendment. And it is hard, but it's not too hard. We can do it. It's been done before. It's been done 26 other times, so we can do it, right?
So that builds on the next question I was going to ask, and I hope Representative Deutch would answer. How do you address the argument that I'm sure we all have heard, which is this is just too tough, it's too hard, it can't be done? Do you hear that, and how do you address it when you do hear it?
Sure. I mean, it is hard. And the framers of the Constitution knew it would be hard. But they also knew that there were times in our nation's history when this would be the only option that we have. And if you look at where the court is now, we have only 2 options. I suppose we could wait around and hope things get better, but it is likely that if we don't act now, that the Supreme Court may well take the next step, which is to overturn the Tillman Act of 1907 that banned direct corporate contributions. The RNC just filed an amicus brief advocating the repeal of the Tillman Act. And so we can wait and see if that happens, at which point we won't just have corporations being able to fund campaigns independently. We will be able to have them give directly to candidates unlimited amounts of money, at which point not only will the system be corrupted further, but it will be nearly impossible to regain the trust of America's citizens and voters if that happens. So yes, it's hard, but we live at a time where social media can topple dictators. So we certainly can rally the support that we need to move forward. Yeah, 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the states to ratify, that's very difficult. But if you think that here we are today, the day of the State of the Union address, and you look back to 1905, when Teddy Roosevelt gave his address to Congress, submitted his address to Congress, and said all contributions by corporations to any political committee or for any political purpose should be forbidden by law, and then went on to further expand on what he wanted, which ultimately became the Tillman Act. All of that is now at risk of unraveling. That's why this is a moment where we have no choice but to act. This is a movement. It doesn't start from us. It starts from the ground. We're seeing the support in cities and states all throughout the country. And I would be remiss, having made the comment about what social media can do, if I did not also point out that the OccupyedAmendment.org is a place where people can see what we're trying to do in order to further this effort. People signing petitions at the various websites, people tweeting, people using Facebook. That's how word spreads. We've seen it happen already. We've seen it happen throughout the world, and we absolutely will see it happen here in America.
Senator Raskin, let me ask you to touch on the question I just asked Representative Deutch in terms of how do you deal with this It's Impossible issue, but also talk for a minute about the particular challenges organizing at the state level. I think I'm correct that there's no statewide resolution calling for an amendment yet to be passed, although there's work going on in a number of places. So I was curious about both, how you respond to the, this is impossible, what difference does it make if we try to do this, and the challenge around organizing at the state level.
One thing we can do is to look at another impossible amendment exactly a century ago, the 17th Amendment, which dealt with transferring the mode of selection of United States senators from the state legislatures to the people. And this was seen by the populists and progressives in explicitly anti-corporate terms, because you had corporations that were going to the state legislatures, spreading money around, and essentially electing U.S. senators. They were called corporation senators, and there was a nationwide movement to try to give the people the power to select U.S. senators. And in a certain sense, you could say a century later, it's come full circle. Now we have to stop the Supreme Court from allowing the corporations to choose everybody for public office, to choose U.S. senators and representatives through their spending. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the presidential primaries right now, increasingly, not just the voters, but the candidates and the campaigns themselves are spectators as they watch huge infusions of outside money come through the super PACs to define the shape and the direction of the race. So I think that a constitutional amendment always seems impossible until it becomes inevitable. And then suddenly everyone says, well, of course we need to do that because that's the logic of our unfolding as a democracy. On your other question, Marge, in Maryland, our legislature disfavors policy resolutions where we just take a position on something, and I know that that's the case in a bunch of state legislatures. So we've written a letter, and already 58 members have signed the letter, and we're going to continue to collect signatures. That was just in a few days. We're going to continue to collect signatures over the next couple weeks. We're planning to get a full majority of the Maryland General Assembly and to send it to Congress to say, pass the constitutional amendment and give it back to the states. I'd say the main thing is for people to understand during a period of intense economic austerity and difficulty for so many people, that this is not an anti-business thing. In some sense, we're going to be saving the corporations or the shareholders a lot of money if we ban this practice. But look, we want corporations to thrive. We want them to profit. We want them to prosper. We want them to succeed. But we don't want them to govern, because that's an extreme danger, because it means that the handful of the largest corporations in the military-industrial complex, in the energy sector, in pharmaceuticals will dictate for all time the public agenda and the nature of our laws. And that we can't have in a real political democracy.
Thank you. So we're, in the last half hour, we're getting tons of great questions. So let me see if I can work those all into what I was hoping we could use the last half hour to do, to talk about what's next. Where do we go from here? And so let me throw out the kinds of questions that are coming up, and folks can choose to answer whichever of those they want. One is in terms of the focus of the remedial language. Is it important to be able to regulate individual contributions as well as corporate contributions? Is this just about regulating what corporations do, or is this also about regulating what individuals do? Second, in terms of the manner of amendment, given the challenges around getting something passed in the Congress, should we be thinking about the alternative way of amending the Constitution, which is going to state legislatures first? Is that a reasonable approach? Another question that keeps coming up in terms of where we go from here is, do we need to get agreement now on what the language of an amendment should be? Or, I mean, I think of the 12 amendments that have been introduced, they're all quite different. And is that good? Is that the healthy debate we should be in, or do we need to agree on particular language? And the other question, everyone on this panel is a Democratic elected official and or probably identified with a progressive organization. Can this movement go forward, or how can this movement go forward, and is it just a progressive issue or not? So I'm going to ask, we've got about a half an hour left, if I could start with Representative Ellison, if that's okay, and just pick one of those areas and kind of where do we go from here?
Say is that if you kind of look back at our nation's history, I think as a professor, senator was talking, he kind of reminded me, you know, this was the era where like the Mellons and the Morgans and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers, I mean, they were running the show. You know, they had amassed enormous wealth, and they were called the robber barons. And, you know, in fact, Mark Twain, I think, called that period the Gilded Age, because some people wanted to call it the Golden Age, but he said, no, it's just looks shiny. It's not really that golden for so many people. And I think the wealthy had amassed a big chunk of American wealth. I think that today we're more unequal, and rich people got a bigger chunk of the wealth than they had even at that time. I'd like somebody to challenge me on that, because I think I am right about that. I think that's important to bear in mind, that we're in worse shape than we were in the industrial age when it comes to this inequality. And then I also want to point out that the people responded during that time, and the progressive era came up, and they're the ones who came up with the 17th Amendment, with all these things that really rolled power back, you know, including NLRB and, you know, different kind of things that enhance the lives of average people. So we can certainly do this, okay? It's been done before. What one people can do, another people can do. So we've just got to think in terms of success, and then be really active and busy. The fact that we have a lot of different versions is not a problem in my mind. We should talk about it, but we need like more. But if the basic concept is corporations are not people and money is not speech, and the people can regulate the corporation, then we're where we need to be. I mean, this process, which allows different ideas to bubble up, is actually a good thing, because I'm sure we will settle on some language eventually, and when we do, maybe we'll have the benefit of a number of approaches. But I think the main thing now is not to sweat the details. We got to keep the main thing, and that is politicians must serve the people, not the corporate interests. And as long as we do that, I think we'll be fine.
Councilwoman?
There was a lot asked there, but I want to just touch on two quick things before I speak specifically to one of the questions. But I think that also when you look at where this conversation is happening and the effect it's having, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was reported yesterday that in the Massachusetts senator's race, right, both candidates are saying that they're going to suspend accepting PAC money for, I don't know if it's till the end of the campaign, but I think it's just, again, bringing up that issue about really the hold that this conversation is taking about how much money is in politics right now, and the effect that it can have. So I think that that's important as well in terms of really gauging where things are and the conversation is happening. We clearly don't have the luxury to sit by the sidelines and to be silent on this issue, and I think that that is the message of today. But I think that if we are going to be effective, we really need to have this be seen beyond a progressive issue, right? It needs to have a broader support of really what is at stake here when we talk about the amount of money that is in politics right now. I don't just see this as an corporate thing, although that's important, I believe, but I think also it's just about limiting money in general in these election cycles. and I think that that's important. It just can't be that, and I know for the congressional reps, it's a hard situation where every 2 years, you know, you have to be raising another $1.5 million, $2 million, and that's where you focus your energy, and you're taking away from really representing your constituents and who is it that you are, you know, where the concerns and interests are. So that's really important. It's also about disclosure and accountability, about knowing where this money is coming from, knowing who is giving that money. We just passed a charter amendment in November 2010 in New York City, and it will be implemented by our campaign finance board soon, which is about disclosure of independent expenditures. We really are aggressive, again, about disclosure, transparency, people that do business with the city of New York. We limit how much you can contribute, and that has basically stood up in the courts as well. And so we really understand this, and we want to see other municipalities and states really expand on their campaign finance programs. It is about limiting money, knowing where it's coming from, and really being able to focus on representing our constituents and hearing the voice of our constituents. And I think that that really is the way I'm approaching this and why I feel a sense of urgency, and particularly when you're talking about communities that have historically been drowned out of these conversations, and there continue to be attempts to do that. But I think the voice of the people and the will of the people will prevail here, and I am committed to continuing down that road.
Thank you, Representative Deutch. Where do we go from here? Any of the issues, do we need to cover individuals as well as corporations? Going to the states first, is this just a Democratic issue? And do we need to get to the same language?
Yes, no. Look, let me start with whether this is just a Democratic issue. No, absolutely not. You can ask, I've been talking about this issue at town hall meetings and campaign events since before I got here. It doesn't matter whether you're a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican or a Tea Party member. The frustration that people have about Congress and the way Congress operates, I sense from all of the discussions I have directly with my constituents, the people I talk to, stems first and foremost from the belief that Congress doesn't work for them. Congress is more interested in working for this corporate special interests. And so, no, it's not just a progressive issue. Now, how do we prove that? Well, yeah, I think it starts with an amendment that deals with corporations, and I think it's not enough just to give Congress the authority to regulate. I think we specifically in the amendment have to outlaw corporate spending by for-profit corporations. But yes, it has to get to individuals and groups of individuals, and that means nonprofits and that means unions, and giving Congress the authority to regulate the amount that those groups can spend, and to give Congress the authority to regulate the amount that campaigns can spend. The difference, and I get this question all the time, why do we focus on, in our amendment, why do we focus on for-profit corporations specifically? Well, as we've all discussed, because for-profit corporations exist for commercial purposes, period. The owners of the corporations are sometimes not only Americans, but foreign entities and foreign individuals. We don't want them to have influence in our elections. But as to individuals, of course we don't want individuals to be able to make $1 million, $5 million, and $20 million contributions because it has the same effect. Likewise, whether you are a union or a nonprofit that is a collection of individuals that associate for a specific purpose, and on the nonprofit side, that could be the NRA, it could be the Sierra Club. If we're going to be serious about restoring some faith in our democracy, then we have to have a rational campaign finance system, and that's a campaign finance system that includes some rational limits on the amount that can be spent so that people feel like their government is working for them again.
Senator Raskin? You can pick from the laundry list.
A couple of quick thoughts here. One is, do we need agreement now on the exact wording of the constitutional amendment? I think the answer is no. I think that competition is a good thing, and I think there are different views out there, and that those the people pushing different bills should be out competing and explaining to the public why they think their approach is the best. And I think as the movement begins to mature and grow, I think we will begin to crystallize an approach, but we need to be having that debate now. You know, as to the question of should the states be calling for a constitutional convention directly rather than trying to get Congress, 2/3 in each house, to amend, you know, it's never been done that way. The states have, you know, the amendments that we've had since the Bill of Rights have all come from Congress first. But in coming from Congress first, they were often responding to pressure from the states. For example, the 17th Amendment, which we were talking about, was one where a lot of states actually, the legislature said, we're going to appoint as U.S. senators the candidates who are chosen by the people of the states. We're going to have an election, and then we will abide by the choice. And so when the state legislatures start getting together, either by formal resolution or by writing letters saying, this is a change that we want, that's very much in the historical pattern. Getting Congress then to adopt a specific amendment and send it to the states. The problem with calling a constitutional convention is you can't confine the subject matter. And so then a lot of people get worried that you get a runaway convention and we start dealing with all kinds of other issues. And you know, I think that there's something to the historical practice of being definite and specific in what the issue is. And I think we do have across the political spectrum consensus now that this is a danger to everybody. And I don't think it's a partisan issue. I think there are lots and lots of Republicans who believe in an honest free market, who don't believe in what the candidates are calling vulture capitalism or crony capitalism, where people use insider political influence in order to gerrymander economic outcomes and essentially get themselves rich quick through political pressure. That has nothing in common with, I think, honest free market competition, which is what most people believe in.
Senator Udall?
Thank you. The reality all of us know is that in order to get a constitutional amendment, you need 2/3 of both bodies. And so we can wait for a long time as Democrats to get our 2/3, but I don't see that coming. So I think we have to focus on Republicans, and this is the time, I think, for Republicans to step outside a party, step outside of the advantage for their party, maybe, in terms of the way the spending's going, and do what's right for the country. That's the way it's happened in the past with campaign finance. McCain-Feingold, very significant bipartisan majority when it was put into place. Most of the campaign finance efforts at both state and federal level have had bipartisanship. One of the reasons I decided to carry forward the constitutional amendment I have in the Senate, last session, we only had 4 co-sponsors. Last Congress, not last session, last Congress, and we're up to 20 now. This is an amendment that in the past has had 11 different Republicans on this constitutional amendment, some of them serving in the Senate now. We don't have a Republican on right now, but I think there's some groundwork that we can do there. But I think we all have to wake up that the big elephant in the room is that if we don't get Republicans on a constitutional amendment, we're not going to be able to get it done. Just to say a brief word about the difficulty. My uncle, who served in the House, Keith Morris Udall, used to say, reform is not for the short-winded. And there's a real truth to that. We need to be willing to battle this day and night until it gets done. The people need to be able to show that same kind of commitment. And as has been said here by, I think, one of our panelists, we've amended the Constitution 26 times. Sometimes it has happened very quickly. When you deal with the 18th Amendment, which dealt with prohibition, happened in a little bit over a year. When you deal with the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women the right to vote, happened in a little bit more than a year. So if the people feel it strongly and the elected leaders stand up and say, we're going to get this done for the people, we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Elena?
Thank you. You know, I think just to draw a little bit on what Senator Raskin was saying, I think there is a unique opportunity for the states and the grassroots to take a leadership role on this effort and to show that it is a bipartisan or transpartisan effort. Common Cause has just launched a program that's called Amend 2012. Our website's amend2012.org. And if you look at the history of voter instructions, as Senator Raskin mentioned, the states have long used their power to show Congress what they wanted to see happen. And I think as we look at what the language needs to be or how specific we want to go, I think right now we've got this organizing opportunity in that there is broad agreement, regardless of party, that there's a disconnect between the people and the people who represent them in Congress. And so if we can capitalize on that to have a conversation about money in politics and the role of corporations in our society, we can then use that to elevate this conversation where passing an amendment is possible at the congressional level. It will be difficult, obviously, but I think for a lot of people, they realize that the smaller Band-Aid solutions aren't going to get us there. So we need to take advantage of that while we can, and as Senator Udall says, make this the opportunity, perhaps, where this can be one of those where the public's outcry is such that we have to move forward and more quickly.
Well, as we wind down, I really appreciate all of you being here and your answering our questions. If there's anything else that we haven't asked or something that you would really like to say before we close, the mic is open and I welcome you to do that. Otherwise, I just want to thank the panelists. Thank you so much for all that you're doing. You really are heroes of this movement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marge.